Hello, U.S. history students. And in this lesson, the final lesson for this first week of World War II, we're going to be talking about strategy. Now, we talked about the beginning of the war. We've looked at it in Europe. We've looked at it in Asia. We've talked about the buildup in the United States and what the United States has been doing there in this time. And of course, Pearl Harbor is going to push us into the war fully. We talked about what resources we're going to bring to the fight. And now we're going to look at the overall plans for both sides, both the Allies and the Axis powers during World War II. What is their strategy in both Europe and the Pacific? Now, you are welcome to take your own notes on this. There's a little chart, I think, on Canvas, maybe. I forget if I downloaded it or not because there's a little map that's making it hard to download. So you might just need to take your own notes on this, but basically make two charts, one for the Allies and one for the Axis. And we're going to talk about the Allies in Europe and the Allies in the Pacific, and then we'll talk about the Axis in Europe and the Axis in the Pacific. Okay? And there'll be a little quiz that follows this as well. So let's start with the Allied strategy. Now, before we get into the strategy itself, let's review who the Allied powers are. In Europe, you have Great Britain or England, the Soviet Union, and then I would also put the United States of America. Even though we're not in Europe, I would put the US. And in parentheses, I would put France, okay? Again, France has been occupied, but the underground French resistance is going to be key in helping the Allies, especially when we get to D-Day. Okay? And if you remember from last week, here's our map. Here are the two Allied nations in Europe. Here's the Soviet Union over here, and here's Britain right here. And of course, we got the underground French resistance in the United States as well. Now, when it comes to Europe, the Allied strategy is defeat Hitler first. Now, when we were talking about U.S. entry into the war, I said this is going to be a hot button issue because there were a bunch of Americans that wanted to go after Japan first. Japan attacked us at Pearl Harbor. They seemed to be the most pressing threat to us. But Churchill and the other Allied leaders of the Atlantic Charter had been talking to FDR before Pearl Harbor. And basically they said, look, we need your help. And I got to be honest with you, the only thing that is standing between us and Hitler is Great Britain. If Great Britain falls, I think it was entirely possible that Hitler would have looked across the Atlantic. Remember, his goal is to conquer any land that Germany once owned, like it lost at the end of World War One, or land that has German-speaking people living on it. There are a bunch of German immigrants in the United States. So I could easily have seen him trying to cross the Atlantic and attack us. And then we would have to fight a two-front war because we'd be going after Japan in the Pacific, and we'd have to worry about Hitler in the Atlantic. So our strategy in Europe is defeat Hitler first. The United States decides to target all of its military resources for Europe first. And the deal is, once we help the Allies in Europe defeat Hitler, then they will help us in the Pacific. That doesn't really materialize. When Hitler's defeated, it's pretty much going to be us in the Pacific. Okay? Now, by that time we've developed the atomic bombs and there are other things in play. But once we defeat Hitler, we're going to focus our attention on the Pacific. The idea is the other allies will back us up, but I'll be honest with you, by that time it's basically us. Now, speaking of the Pacific, what is our strategy in the Pacific? It is something called island hopping. And island hopping is exactly what it says. We're going to start in Pearl Harbor, okay? And from Pearl Harbor, we're going to use that as a base of operation, and we're going to hop from island to island to island, okay? Like I said, island hopping is exactly what it says. We are going to seize islands moving closer and closer to Japan. And then the idea is once we amass a bunch of forces here, because what happens is we seize the islands, we turn them into military bases, okay? And then we can use those islands to attack Japan, all right? Technology, what it is, it's going to take us. I mean, it is foreseeable because Japan did this to us. We could attack Japan from Pearl Harbor, but it's a long distance. They're going to see us coming. So the idea is we use these islands, we get closer and closer, we build up our forces, we build up our supplies, and then we can attack Japan closer inland to them. Okay? That's our plan in the Pacific. All right? So in Europe, it's defeat Hitler first. And to be honest with you, that's the overarching plan. Get Hitler out of the way first, then focus on the Pacific. We're going to use island hopping and get closer and closer to Japan, and then use those islands as bases and attack Japan much closer into them. Now, what is the Axis strategy? Okay. Oh, before we get to the Axis strategy, one more thing. We started this before Pearl Harbor. We're going to intensify that embargo. Remember, an embargo is cutting off supplies and cutting off trade. We are going to use our submarines and our Navy to basically surround Japan and cut off supplies to Japan and cut off trade to Japan, not just from us, okay, but from their Axis friends as well. Okay, so between the embargo, which is going to stop supplies and trade coming into Japan, and the fact that we are moving closer and closer through this island hopping strategy, the idea is we will eventually be able to attack Japan and get them out, and hopefully this embargo will make them weak enough to where it won't cost that many lives. But more on that later. Okay, so once again, Allied strategy. Overall strategy is defeat Hitler first. In Europe, that's what we're going to do, is defeat Hitler first. And then we'll switch our sights to the Pacific. Between the embargo and island hopping, we're going to get close into Japan and attack Japan rather quickly. Okay, that's the plan. Okay, that's the plan. Now, what is the Axis strategy? Again, let's look at it in Europe. And let's look at it in the Pacific. Now, before we get into strategy, let's remind ourselves, what are the Axis powers? Well, you got Germany, you got Italy, you got Austria, and you got Japan. Okay, even though our attention has so far has been on Europe, okay, don't forget Japan's out there as well. Okay, just like don't forget the United States on the Allied side. Okay, so we got Japan, Italy, Austria, and Germany. Now, what is the strategy in Europe? Remember, Hitler has taken over all this land. He's used blitzkrieg, that lightning war tactic. We send in the planes, we bomb, then we send in our ground forces, and we take over the areas. That's been pretty successful. But he's been stopped at Great Britain. Great Britain is not bowing like some of the other countries are. So Hitler has decided to switch gears. And his first plan, his first step, is to defeat the Soviet Union quickly. He decides to stab Stalin in the back because he needs oil in the Soviet Union. And on this map, you can see how quickly or how far into the Soviet Union he gets. I mean, he's right outside Moscow. He's right at Stalingrad, okay? So you can see Hitler makes some progress into the Soviet Union, okay? But then he stopped, all right? By the way, this is also why he goes down into North Africa, because he thinks if he goes into North Africa, then he can swing up this way and attack Russia from the bottom, okay? But the idea is we're going to defeat the Soviet Union quickly, gain control of the Soviet oil fields, all right? Then the second part is once the Soviet Union is out of the way and we got all this oil, then we can refocus our attention on Great Britain and force Great Britain out of the war through a combination of bombings and submarine warfare. Okay? So these are Hitler's two main points in Europe. Okay? And you don't have to copy this down. You've already copied it down. Defeat the Soviet Union quickly, gain control of the oil fields, force Great Britain out of the war through a bombing campaign and submarine warfare. One of the things I want to do in this presentation is show you why the Axis strategy is probably doomed to fail. Number one, even though Hitler makes great progress in the Soviet Union, he is not able to break the Soviet Union, the will of the Soviet people. And they dig in around Moscow and Stalingrad, and they ain't moving. Plus, Hitler probably should have paid attention in history class, because when does he decide to attack the Soviet Union? Right as winter is getting to set in. And the Soviet winter is much harsher than the German winter, and his troops are not prepared. Okay? And they actually go through two winters. Things thaw out, they keep moving, and they're getting closer to Moscow, and they're getting closer to Stalingrad. But the Soviet people dig in again, and the Germans have to undergo another winter. And then this time, when things start to stall out, it's the Soviets that begin to push back. So this idea of getting the Soviet Union out quickly never materializes. The same thing happens with Britain. Okay? Britain did not bow to Germany in the first place, and they're definitely not going to bow now. All right? And so basically what Hitler's having to do is he's having to fight a two-front war, and he's not prepared to do that. He's got the Soviets still in the east, and he's got Britain still in the west, and nobody's moving. And then the third part of his strategy was to keep the U.S. out as much as possible. He does not want the U.S. involved because he knows we are a big industrial power. And no offense, Japan screws him. Because when Japan when Japan attacks us at Pearl Harbor, we are involved. And by the time Hitler realizes what's going on, the Soviets are beginning to push on the east. We're involved in the war. We're backing Britain up in the west, and Hitler is getting squished on both sides. So the Axis strategy in Europe is probably doomed to fail early on, because Hitler's not able to accomplish the first two goals, and then because of Japan, the third goal goes out the window as well. Now, speaking of Japan, what is their strategy in the Pacific? Because they are the dominant Axis power in the Pacific. Well, we've kind of already talked about it. Their plan is to invade. Okay, they take over the Philippines, they take over Indonesia, and then their plan is to go after Australia and Hawaii. Now, while they attack us at Pearl Harbor, they do not overrun Hawaii. Okay, and they don't overrun Australia either. Now, what's interesting about this is they assume it's going to kind of be like Hitler in Europe, that they're going to start taking over all these places. They've taken over China, they've taken over Manchuria, they've taken the Philippines, they've taken Indonesia. And the second part of their plan is they just assume people are going to accept it, right? Especially us, that we're just going to accept their predominance in Asia and Pacific, and everybody's going to back down, and they're not going to have to worry about a bloody and costly war, because we'll be too scared to go after them. All right, we don't want to have a bloody war. All right, that's what they think. And once again, is that what happens? No. Their plans are doomed to fail as well. Yes, they got China. Yes, they got Manchuria. Yes, they got the Philippines. Yes, they got Indonesia. They deal us a heavy blow at Pearl Harbor, but they never take the islands. They never get Australia. So part one doesn't exist. And this idea that nobody is going to take notice, that people are just going to step back and let Japan be dominant in Asia, nope, that doesn't materialize either. We start to fight back. In fact, we started to fight back when they took over China and Manchuria, because we know that they cut off oil and they cut off shipments of iron and steel, the things that Japan was using to militarize. We cut those off. So that should have been a clue in the first place that we weren't just going to accept Japanese predominance in Asia. Now, those are the strategies of both sides in both theaters. Okay? For the Allies, they're going to defeat Hitler first. That's the overall strategy. Then in the Pacific, they're going to use embargoes and island hopping to get close to Japan and defeat Japan. For the Axis powers, in Europe, Hitler thinks he's going to knock the Soviet Union out quickly, he thinks he's going to knock Britain out quickly, and he thinks he's going to keep us out of the war. And none of those happen. In the Pacific, Japan thinks it's going to take over all this territory and people are just going to accept it, and none of that happens either. Now, next week, we're going to start looking at specific battles and things like that, specific actions during the war. We're going to talk about the contributions of specific groups. So we'll actually get into more of the fighting next week. This is just an overview of the overall strategy. Using this information, okay, take a few minutes to review and then take your little quiz on strategy during World War II.